So politicians, if you listen to any of their solutions, they're always talking about the needs to lift people up out of some deprived situation, or the reason why things are a problem is it's a deprived area. Relative, whilst the boats might be rising for people, we've got a relative poverty issue, and I think it's fair to say that you don't subscribe to that notion of viewing people in this economic way, and in fact you say that this is indicative of pauperism. So maybe you can tell us what pauperism is and how it affects us.
Well, pauperism is a condition in which people have to accept what they are given. They or do accept what they're given. And in a sense, the NHS makes us paupers because we don't have any choice in the matter of what we get. And you can see down my doctor's surgery, people queuing up for an appointment, and when they get an appointment, it's like they've been awarded a medal. And it's very difficult to get an appointment. And so this actually, with regard to the medical treatment, it pauperizes them in the sense that they have to accept what they're given. And can't really go elsewhere. Now, it is true that they may get very good treatment, but they're still paupers. I mean, it's obviously many people do get very good treatment under the National Health Service. Many people don't, and it's trying to get treatment, certainly for anything that is not an emergency, is a very unpleasant process in Britain, which it isn't actually so much anyway in France, for example, where they spend about the same on healthcare as we do. So we have pauperized ourselves, and one of the things that has maintained that pauperization is a long lie, which was that the National Health Service was a tremendous achievement. And when we go out and start clapping the NHS, and thank you NHS, you'd think that no other country in the world had any doctors or any medicine or any hospitals or any care of anyone. And furthermore, in this country before the NHS, there was no healthcare whatsoever either, which is a lie. It's a lie. But it has been successfully insinuated into the minds of the British population. I've forgotten what you asked now. But anyway.
Well, I was asking about pauperism, what it is, which you described, but also how it affects us, and specifically linking it back initially to the way that we talk about poverty in the country, deprived people, deprivation, deprived areas, using that as a reason behind bad things happening. I know we've talked a lot about agency. I know this is another example, perhaps, of stripping people of agency. Maybe there's something else to add to it.
Well, I mean, one of the things that is devastating is the idea of the economy as a cake. And if you have a slice, then that's a slice I don't have. So the question is how we divide up the cake. And that is, I think, it's a disastrous way of thinking about an economy. I was once in a debate, I won't say who it was because I don't want to be personally nasty, but it was a journalist from The Guardian about the nature of poverty. And I pointed out that her own newspaper had recently published a survey of household wealth, not by social class or by employment or by education or by anything else, but by religious affiliation. And what was interesting is that the two richest religions were Judaism and Sikhism. And interestingly, both these groups had a certain degree of prejudice against them when they arrived en masse in this country. But within a generation or two, they were the most prosperous group as has when you look at at religious groups. And the person with whom I was debating said, well, of course they were immigrants, and immigrants often have a drive, a different character. I said, yes, that's precisely my point. My point is that poverty is not a state from which it is impossible to escape in a reasonably open society, as Britain still was, and to an extent still is, although I believe less so than it was. So that we're changing largely from a class to a caste society.
What do you mean by that?
It seems to me. Well, that actually it's more difficult to escape the social milieu in which you were born than it used to be. Of course, it also means that there must be the possibility of going downhill as well as uphill. So, and I do know people whose children do precisely that. So the whole point is that if poverty were a condition from which it is impossible to escape, we could none of us ever have become richer. But even now, even the poorest person is in certain respects much richer than Louis XIV, lives a much more comfortable life than did Louis XIV, and certainly lives more comfortably than the poorest people 50 years ago or 60 years ago. You have only to look at photographs, shall we say, of the back streets of Newcastle 60 years ago to know that nobody lives like that now. So it simply isn't true that that one is just the victim of one's fate and nothing else. Of course, it's much easier for some people than others. Some are born with silver spoons in their mouth and some are not. And there is a level of misery and degradation from which it probably is almost impossible to escape. But that isn't the case with most people, even now. And yet we propagandize as if it were true. And the problem is that this forges the mind forge manacles, as William Blake put it. I don't know that he meant it in my meaning, but I think it's a very good line to describe what I'm talking about. If you believe that you can't escape from something, and there's no point in what you doing anything, then of course you won't make any great efforts. And there is that kind of attitude in Britain to a greater extent, I think, than in most countries.
I think what's also interesting about this pauperism, this psychological condition, is that even those people that you drew as an example, living in Newcastle back streets, you can say that people don't live like that now. I'm not entirely sure they suffered from pauperism, because when you look at photos of, say, there's some wonderful footage from early 1900s that is resurfaced, where you see factory workers standing outside of buildings in Preston. They're working class, or they're in Blackburn, or they're in Newcastle, and they're dressed in their tweeds. They've got their flat caps. They look good, and that's different to. I know this isn't exactly the same point, but you walk the streets today and well-dressed people are absolutely in the minority, including amongst the more well-to-do classes. But those people who had not a lot, as we would say, they didn't have a pot to piss in, they didn't seem to grumble so much. In fact, there were always those stories of the hardy grandmothers who were just like, well, I never had that when I was growing up. And yet they still managed to birth these progeny that went on to make something of themselves. So they didn't have a "oh God, we're buggered" story.
Yeah, well, I mean, there has been an enormous change. If you look at football crowds of 70 years ago, 80 years ago, They were well dressed. They seemed to be, I mean, they didn't always behave well. There is no golden age in all respects, but on the whole, they behaved pretty well. They were not vile. I remember I used to go to football matches when I was 11, on my own, or not on my own, with another boy of 11, or 10 even. And there were huge crowds. And I can remember once, and in those days you stood up. The seats were for the richer adults, and they were in a minority. And I stood on the terrace with 40 or 50,000 people, and I remember hearing, and this is late 50s, people saying, "No swearing, there are children present." Now, a newspaper sent me to a football match where we were all sitting, so the physical conditions were infinitely better than they had been. And I was sitting, and I'd been sent by the newspaper to report on what I saw. And I don't. Am I allowed to swear on this? Yes. Anyway, there was a man and his son, and he looked perfectly normal to me. And something happened on the field, and the man stood up and started swearing and shouting and saying, I'll use what he actually said. This is a quotation. "Who the fuck do you think you are? Who the fuck do you think you are?" Now, that father was being watched by, I think his son was about 11, about the age that I remember people saying, "No swearing, there's a child here." And this is I think, a significant change. Unfortunately, it has gone right throughout the whole of society. So vulgarization has occurred throughout society. The same newspaper sent me to Rome to watch a so-called friendly match between England and Italy. And there were 10,000 English fans there. There hadn't been anything like it since the downfall of the Roman Empire in 410. It was terrible. And these people was shouting abuse for hours on end, vulgar abuse. And of course, going to Rome for a football match, you have to have quite a large discretionary income. It's not the kind of thing that a very poor person can do. And actually, they were all middle class. And I asked the chap next to me at half time, because he was making a terrible noise the rest of the time, as they all were. I said, "Excuse me, I hope you don't mind me asking, but why have you come all this way to shout abuse at the Italians?" And he said, "You have to let your hair down." And so I said, "Why do you have to?" To which he had absolutely no answer. And in fact, this kind of behavior there's a kind of a vicious circle, because the more you indulge in it, the more you indulge in it, and the more vulgar you have to be.